that, please welcome Tyler Wilson, who's going to talk on the outlook for LNG and natural gas pipeline exports. Tyler, they're all yours.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'd like to talk to you about our look for natural gas exports. This includes both exports in LNG and exports through pipelines. And am I at a good volume for everybody? Okay, good. So I would like everyone here to come away from my presentation with 5 key messages. The first key message is that the global LNG market is oversupplied, and there's a lot of uncertainty moving forward. Second is that large-scale LNG capacity in the United States is very competitive with large-scale capacity elsewhere in the world. Third is that a lot of projects have been announced in the U.S., except the likelihood that all of these are going to move forward is slim to none. Fourth is that in addition to LNG exports, pipeline exports are also going to be growing. This is primarily exports to Mexico to feed new gas-fired power generation plants. And fifth, and probably the most important message of my presentation, is that by 2025, it is likely that the U.S. will be exporting about 20% of all natural gas that it produces. So as I said before, the global LNG market is oversupplied, and the dynamics are changing rapidly. One of the things that's changing very quickly is the number of countries that are importing LNG. The number of countries importing LNG has expanded greatly over the past several years, and the reasons they're importing are changing as well. Historically, the major importers of LNG were Japan and China, and they're using LNG as a primary fuel for electricity generation. But now, with more countries importing LNG, the reasons are changing as well. Countries like China and Brazil are importing LNG to complement their current electricity generation mix, while countries like India are importing to displace dirtier fuels, like coal. And in the US and Europe, there's limited applications so far for LNG as a bunkering fuel. So with the change in countries has also come a change in LNG contracting trends. From 2008 to 2016, the total volumes of the LNG spot trade increased greatly, as well as the percentage from about 28% in 2008 to over 30% in 2016. Also, the average contract length in terms of years has changed as well, going from almost 20 years in 2008 to 7 years in 2016. Contract size has also shrunk as well, with average sizes being over 2 million tons per annum 8 years ago, and now less than 1. And with the wider range of countries importing LNG, the creditworthiness has also changed as well. Historically, all the LNG importers were of investment-grade credit quality, and now slightly less are not of investment grade, which would be a B rating or lower. So here we have a basic supply and demand chart for LNG. The blue bar represents our base case demand for LNG globally, and the gray bar representing the high case. And there's a lot of variability in this number in 2020 and 2025. And the orange line represents supply. And if you look at demand from 2000 to 2010, it more than doubled. And there were a lot of LNG project there were a lot of companies who saw this explosion in the growth of demand and built a lot of supply to feed that, especially in Australia. So as those projects came online, you can see an uptick from 2010 to 2015 in the supply. However, demand growth slowed, and that is primarily due to slowing economic growth in the developing world, in developing nations. So right now we're looking at an oversupplied LNG market, and we expect this to continue until at least 2025. With an oversupplied LNG market comes an oversupplied LNG market has downward pressure on prices, and globally LNG prices have been declining year after year for the past several years. So this is especially prevalent in Latin America, where prices are less than half of what they were in 2012. In Asia Pacific, prices have dropped almost $3 per million BTU. And even in North America, where prices were already low, prices went from over $4 to under $2. The second key message I'd like to get across to you today is that the large-scale LNG exports from North America are very competitive with their counterparts across the world. And the business model that these projects are using is also different. So here we have a map of the United States with the different LNG export projects that have been announced. The vast majority of them are on the Gulf Coast, with two notable exceptions, both under construction on the East Coast, which is Elba Island and Dominion's Cove Point project in Maryland. So as part of the analysis that we do for LNG markets, we have a cost of supply model that estimates a DES cost of supply to various parts of the globe, depending on where the project is located and capital costs for that project. So the taller bars, the blue bars, represent cost of supply coming from Australia, and the left two bars are going to Asia. The right two bars going to Europe. And due to cost inflation in Australia, the cost of supply is much higher than it is for projects on the U.S. Gulf Coast. I'm sure everyone here is familiar with the Gorgon LNG project and their absolutely massive cost overruns, and we have not seen that level of cost overruns here in the United States. So I mentioned before that LNG project developers in the U.S. are using a different business model than they are globally, and I'd like to describe that a little bit further. In Australia, for example, they're using a more integrated model where the project developers own the upstream and the midstream assets. Now, there are some benefits to that. They don't have to worry about, are they going to have enough supply? However, they are more subject to commodity price risk, versus in the United States, the project developers they have a tolling model where they're essentially just getting a liquefaction fee for every million BTU of LNG they produce. I like to say that they're kind of like they're just batting singles all day, all year long. But since they do not own the upstream and midstream assets, they have to have different gas sourcing strategies, and there are 4 key levers that LNG project developers can pull in order to have a superior gas sourcing strategy. The first is having redundant pipeline capacity. What I mean by that is that there is more pipeline capacity going to the plant than is actually necessary. For example, Cheniere Sabine Pass liquefaction project has about 33% more capacity going to it than it actually uses every single day. The second is to use multiple counterparties. So you are purchasing gas from multiple companies in multiple basins, and in order to try to take advantage of better prices. And another way to take advantage of better prices is through the third lever, which is varying contract lengths. You are locking in a lower price for a longer period, you are locking in a lower price for a long period of time when you can, and when prices are high, you're only buying on the spot market, so you are not stuck with that high gas price for a very long time. And fourth, and certainly, or last but not least, would be having very adequate back office support with traders and risk management personnel. The third message I'd like to speak about is that there are many of these LNG projects have been proposed, but not a whole lot of them will be moving forward. And the projects that are better advantaged have different gas sourcing strategies, they have contracted offtake agreements, and are further along in the regulatory process. So this is an output from our LNG project benchmarking model, and we benchmark projects based on 4 criteria. The y-axis, we're benchmarking them based upon cost, which would be in dollars per ton, and the percentage of offtake agreements that they have secured, and the x-axis being their regulatory status and their timeline. And the reason the regulatory status and timeline are different is because when we say timeline, we mean giving an edge to the first movers, not just because they're far along in the regulatory process, but because For example, Sabine Pass is already exporting gas where some projects are, or most projects are only on paper. So the projects in the upper right-hand portion of the chart here are the projects that we believe are best advantaged, and all of those, with the exception of Magnolia, are already under construction, with a few of them already exporting LNG volumes. The projects in the lower left, we call them undifferentiated, but that doesn't mean that none of these projects will be moving forward. I think that a good measure for these projects in the lower left is actually closely monitoring the projects in the lower right, and let me describe that a little bit more. The projects in the upper right have received mostly all the regulatory approvals they need. They have FERC construction approvals, DOE, FTA, non-FTA export licenses. They have investors. A lot of them are already running. They've already broken ground. They're very far ahead. But, for example, at Sabine Pass, they have plans for a 6th train, but they have not yet taken a final investment decision because they do not have contracted offtake. And I think that if we see a lot of empty volumes, I think that's the best way to put it, but a lot of empty volumes for the projects in the upper right, we will not be seeing a lot of projects in the lower left move forward. And expanding on that a little bit more, we have a chart here which represents contracted and uncontracted LNG volumes from the major projects, the ones that were in the upper right. Good. So if you take the contracted volumes and you put them on a timeline, this is essentially what you get for what the total export estimates for LNG. A lot of this capacity is coming on in 2018 and 2019, and by 2020, we estimate that we're going to be exporting about 75 million tons per annum of LNG. And in BCFD, that is just under 10. The fourth message is that in addition to LNG exports, pipeline exports are also going to be growing, and the growth is coming from natural gas demand in Mexico, primarily to feed new natural gas fired power plant, power generation facilities. So here, the blue bars represent Mexican natural gas production. The orange line represents Mexican natural gas consumption. It's the production of natural gas growth has not kept up with demand growth, and this problem is going to continue, or the gap is going to widen, primarily because there's about 15 gigawatts of natural gas-fired power generation coming on in Mexico in the next several years. And consequently, U.S. exports to Mexico for natural gas via pipelines have exploded. From 2000 to 2010, it grew at about 10% per year, but from 2010 to 2016, that number grew to over 25% per year annual growth. And when we look at Canada, conversely, there was robust growth from 2000 to 2010, but from 10 to 16, it's been stagnant and even shrinking from its peak in 2012. And this is because in Canada, they are producing almost twice as much natural gas as they are consuming. And the reason that we were exporting to them from 2000 to 2010 was because we're exporting from the northeast of the United States to the southeast of Canada, with much of the natural gas production in Canada being further away. So it is actually cheaper to just to ship it from the northeast to the southeast of Canada rather than ship it across the very large country of Canada. So in the fifth key message I have, and probably the most important message, is that we believe by 2025 the U.S. will be exporting about 20% of its natural gas production through a combination of LNG and pipeline exports. So here is our estimate for natural gas exports from the United States. The blue bar represents our base case, which is about 17 BCFD. The gray bar being our high case at 20 BCFD. And the difference between the blue and the gray bar is the is the gray bar represents the amount of uncontracted capacity that is in those first wave upper right-hand LNG projects. So for example, if Cameron, Corpus, Freeport, and Sabine Pass contract out all the trains that they have planned, that is our high case, and that leads to about 20 BCFD of natural gas exports. Breaking that down a little bit further, on the left here we have US LNG exports. Almost nothing in 2015, and we think it's going to grow significantly grow significantly in 2020, 2025, with the high case being the uncontracted volumes I just spoke about. The middle chart being export volumes to Mexico, we think are going to about peak out in 2020 after a lot of those gas-fired plants have already started. And we also estimate that, that pipeline exports to Canada are going to stagnate. So again, if you take away only 5 things from my presentation, I want it to be first that the global LNG market is changing rapidly. 2, LNG exports from the US are competitive with LNG exports from other places in the world. 3, there are a lot of LNG projects in the US, except most of them are not moving forward. 4, pipeline exports are also going to be growing in addition to LNG exports. And 5, the most important point is that by 2025, we estimate that 20% of US natural gas volumes will be exported through a combination of LNG and natural gas pipelines. I thank you all for listening to my presentation, and I'm sure there will be questions. Yes?
Sure. How relevant are shipping costs between destinations all around the world? Are they pretty equalized? And secondly, a lot of the decisions where you're buying your gas from in the future, LNG, might be politically made. Have you figured that into any of your equations?
Yes. I'm sorry, my phone's going off here. Okay, so your first question about shipping costs. A lot of times shipping costs, especially from the US Gulf Coast to Asia, are relatively high because they will be using the Panama Canal, and there's a surcharge to use the Panama Canal. Otherwise, you have to go all the way around the tip of South America, like Ferdinand Magellan, and it's not quite feasible. Your second question being was about politically sensitive reasons, right? Yeah, and we have seen some political reasons for importing LNG. For example, in Poland, they built an LNG import terminal because they don't necessarily want to be relying on pipeline gas from Russia. There have been plans for an FLNG facility off the coast of Israel in order to keep it off the ground. So yes, we do account for that. But unfortunately, when it comes to political turmoil, it is something that is a lot harder to estimate than macroeconomic factors. Yes. Oh, sorry.
In the forecast growth of LNG, what percent of that growth till 2025 comes from the U.S., and who are we competing with for that growth? Meaning, if we move another 1 million tons, whose LNG plant are we stopping when we do that? Who's the margin?
So I think that the U.S. projects are mainly competing against projects in Australia. A lot of those projects have already been built. There are some projects in Africa that are also being built, some FLNG projects, except I think those have a little bit longer time frame. They're not quite happening as soon as the U.S. LNG projects are. So are you thinking in the next just couple of years?
Well, I'm thinking ones that haven't been sanctioned. So if I'm trying to appropriate an LNG project, I've already started building it, that's another thing. Not to appropriate it, I do the economics. I see a U.S. Gulf Coast overhang that ought to be a pretty damn low-cost source of gas and production. And it would seem hard for a company to think they could have an economic competitive project compared to that U.S. one. And the only way I think they would do it is if, like, Qatar wanted to move gas, and so they want to monetize a natural resource. So I was just wanting to get a sense of how much of that growth of new plant announcements you sense would be coming out, be the U.S.? And you can give a sense, and then you all can work on it and send it out in email.
Steve, if I can just comment on that. So, I think Tyler is right that to a large extent you're competing with Australian LNG capacity, right? So, if you think about it, right, large-scale LNG projects will not be built unless the bulk of the capacity is contracted. So, when a new LNG plant comes up, it is not competing with offtake or output from existing LNG plants. It is competing with other plants that are coming around at the same time.
Yeah.
So, or are being financed at the same time.
Yeah.
So essentially, right, any uncontracted volumes are, and the other stories that Tyler was talking about, right, the relative share of LNG volumes that are being traded on the spot market are rising. So essentially what is happening is the LNG capacity that's coming up in North America will either compete with the volumes that are being traded on the spot market or will be competing with uncontracted capacity that is in Australia.
But I'm talking about investment decisions, where they actually start to spend the money. There's announcements, there's ones that are already being built, those are on either side. But somebody's about to make a decision to put an investment in. It would seem to me that the U.S. is in a great position to win those battles, but I'm sort of myopic American, so I don't know. I was just curious.
No, I mean, not right now. I mean, right now the LNG market, as Tyler showed, is oversupplied, right? And it is going to be likely oversupplied till we think it's 2025, but other more optimistic assessments are it's going to be oversupplied until 2023, 2022. So I think until then, right, a lot of FIDs will look at that picture and say, are probably a lot of FIDs are going to be delayed because of that picture.
Okay, question over here, then we'll take yours. We'll get everybody.
Three projects. You look pretty fast on some of these projects and make an overall assessment of some of them. Cove Point, Texas LNG in Brownsville, and those two start with what is your overall assessment of that chance of them moving forward?
Well, Cove Point's already under construction, so very good. Texas LNG Brownsville, they, I guess probably, I've heard a lot of talk about Texas LNG Brownsville, except I've yet to see final investment decisions. I've yet to see major regulatory approvals. And that's part of the issue that comes with a lot of those projects that were in the lower left, is that there are intangibles that are very hard to measure when it comes to those projects moving forward. For example, one of the projects that has a lot of intangibles going for it is Driftwood LNG, the Tellurian project. The fact that Sharif Suki's name is on it helps quite a bit, and basically because of that, they've already received something like $250 million of investment. So as far as Texas LNG Brownsville goes, I think it is relatively undifferentiated from those projects, but that is not to say that it is necessarily a poor project.
I think the project is very economical.
I also heard that they're trying to do them on a smaller scale,
Right.
liquefaction trains. So we're
Yes.
have a world scale plant doing 4 to 6 million tons on one train. They're looking at something like 2 to 3 at the peak.
Yeah, 2 trains that are about 2 MTPA, I believe. We actually have, right after this presentation, I believe, is our panel on mid-scale LNG. And some of our experts on that might be able to shed a little more light in regards to Texas LNG Brownsville, it being a mid-scale project. Gentleman in the blue shirt?
Yeah, so you mentioned that the demand from Mexico is being driven by, gas demand from Mexico is being driven by the power plants which are coming online.
Yes.
Have they placed the contracts, intake contracts already, or is it uncontracted demand which, as the pipelines come online, then they are going to buy the gas? Do you have any mechanism?
Truthfully, I do not know if that pipeline capacity has been contracted or not. We looked at estimates for natural gas demand in Mexico and the drivers for those, but I have not personally looked at if the pipeline capacity has been contracted or not. So I apologize. I'm not able to answer your question.
We'll have time for almost everybody.
Could you just go over a little bit what the competitive situation is for the U.S. supplying Europe with LNG? You had that up there on the slide a bit, but I think you talked mostly about the supply going to Asia relative to Australia. And who is the U.S. competing with mainly if you're talking about European supplies?
So European supplies, the U.S. is very competitive. Moving across the Atlantic, shipping costs are lower than they are moving to Asia. And Uday, please correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that a lot of the competition for supplying Europe with LNG is coming from the Middle East.
Yeah, on LNG volumes, yes, but I think LNG is not really the marginal supply for gas into Europe, right? The marginal supply for gas into Europe is essentially Russian pipeline gas, right? So Europe has a lot of options, and therefore, although the economics of supplying LNG from North America to Europe are very competitive, it's always hard for LNG to compete with any pipeline gas, right? So therefore, the marginal supplier and the price setting mechanism in Europe is always going to be Russian pipeline gas. And Russia has actually been very flexible and friendly in supplying gas into Europe. We're not quite seeing the same battles that we saw, let's say, 3 or 4 years back. So because they recognize the volume of LNG, the oversupply, and they're worried that they'll lose the relationships if they don't provide gas at the right price into their European customers.
This way, then we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you next.
Yeah, your thoughts on Western Canada?
I think the outlook is negative. The cost of supply in terms of dollars per ton was oftentimes at least 30-40% higher than projects on the Gulf Coast. I read an article last week. The headline was that it was something along the lines of British Columbia LNG lives on, but only in the eyes of the government. So I think that the ratio between the price of gas and oil is going to have to change significantly in order to have Western Canadian projects be economical.
Okay, over here in the back there.
In your feasibility analysis, have you considered the chance or the risk of regasification? Regasification, the receiving end is going to cost billions. Do those have been factored into your projection feasibility at all? That's one of the biggest concerns here.
Right. So.
New market especially.
Right.
Existing market is all saturated.
Right.
If you go to the new market, where regasification is required.
So when we're doing our, you're talking about the LNG project benchmarking, right? Like whether these projects are moving forward.
That's how we're going to forecast for demand, right? What are the bases? Have you considered the building of regasification at the receiving end?
So the building of regasification is not necessarily that is going to be in parallel with offtake agreements, in my opinion. The reason for that is that, let's say in the Caribbean, which is a growing LNG market, they're not going to be able to sign offtake agreements if they do not have the proper regasification capacity. So I guess that's a roundabout way of saying that we're not directly measuring regas capacity. In terms of that model, we have a list of regas capacity, but it is reflected in the offtake agreement part of that model.
There's a question here. And then we can...
Yeah, I agree. The global supply of LNG is going to be with us for at least 5 years, and market's king right now. So any of these projects that go forward have to have the market. But do you see any impact under the new administration, particularly when they're talking about changing regulations and doing away with a lot of, say, DOE, if they just outright, the last administration was slow walking a lot of the export licenses. Do you see any impact, or have you done any analysis based on the fact that if they ease up on the restrictions or move the licensing quicker, that it'll impact these projects?
Yeah, so I had the regulatory presentation this afternoon as well, and I don't directly talk about LNG projects, but so as far as Department of Energy export licenses go, you look at there's 2 projects that received non-FTA approvals with Jordan Cove and Oregon's now been axed, and same thing with Lake Charles. So I don't know as if the regulatory is, as far as export approvals, is necessarily the holdup, because even when they had those export approvals, they were unable to secure contracted agreements. So, and FERC has remained relatively independent. There may be some slight acceleration for construction approvals, but like I said before, these projects are not moving forward unless they already have contracted offtake agreement.
This question, David, next.
I should have asked it earlier. Could you unpack that discussion just a little bit about Australia and the comparison? Because if the comparison is that bad, then Asia's going to be a market for us, is it not?
So when you look at who owns Australian LNG projects, a lot of times a company that is importing the gas owns a significant portion of that project. So they're going to buy anyway. If you own a third of the liquefaction facility, you are that is essentially the contracted agreement. For example, like Osaka Gas, Tokyo Gas, Kogas, they own interest in the projects. So even though the investment that they've already made is essentially a sunk cost, they're going to take it. Yes, for the companies that own interest in the LNG projects, not for companies that do not own interest in LNG projects.
So it's a slightly different question. Your fifth point said that about 20% of natural gas is leaving the country, either as LNG or through pipelines towards Mexico. I have the impression that this could be an issue of scale, that there's a lot of methanol capacity being built right now, and I was under the impression that a lot of that methanol was headed out of the country. Is it comparable to what's going out as LNG, or is it really much smaller?
In terms of volumes, significantly smaller. For example, Ron, you did the talk on methanol. A world-class methanol plant might be 1 million tons per annum, versus a world-class LNG plant being north of 20 million tons per annum. Yeah. So the overall volumes of methanol, the capacity that is under construction for methanol is significantly smaller than it is for LNG.
It's like 120 million cubic feet a day versus the one more question. Who's the highest bidder for last one?
So can you speak to the 2020 IMO standards and kind of the economics around shipping operators considering LNG?
Yeah, so the 2020 IMO standards, they're under review in 2018, if I do remember correctly. They might be pushed off to 2025. But for those of you who are not familiar with that, the IMO standards that you're referring to would be moving the maximum sulfur content limit from 3.5 to 0.5%, correct? So if we see that, if that does indeed come to fruition in 2020, operators have more or less 3 options. They can either convert their fleets to LNG, they can install scrubbers, or they can burn ultra low sulfur diesel. So our view for that is that will help the LNG marine market. However, the vast majority are still going to be run on diesel and heavy fuel oil because switching costs are extraordinarily high, and it will still be cheaper to either burn low sulfur diesel, or to install scrubbers.
Thank you very much. If there are more questions, Alan, you could ask Tyler something at the break as we have to move on. But there was a lot of great questions. Thank you very much.